She was dirty, hungry, and forgotten by the world until a millionaire offered her a seat beside him at the wedding of the year, and what she did there turned every head. Before we begin this story, where are you watching from? Comment below and enjoy. It was one of those chilly New York mornings when the city seemed to move too fast for anyone who couldn't keep up. Businessmen rushed in suits, taxis blared past traffic lights, and no one paid attention to the woman curled up beside the 49th Street subway entrance. Her hair was tangled, her clothes worn thin by countless nights in the cold. Her name was Ava. Once a university student with dreams of becoming a writer, now just another face people ignored. But today was different. Daniel Whitmore stepped out of his sleek black Rolls-Royce, dressed in a navy suit that screamed wealth and influence. He was the youngest millionaire in the city's real estate game and had just received an invitation to the wedding of his ex-fiancée, Madison Hayes. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the wedding. Celebrities, CEOs, media, a performance of love between Madison and the man she left Daniel for. Daniel didn't want to attend alone. No, he wanted to make a statement that he had moved on to, and in the most unexpected way. His eyes scanned the sidewalk until they landed on Ava. Something about her struck him, not just the desperation in her eyes, but the defiance in the way she sat, like life hadn't crushed her completely. He walked over, ignoring the strange looks from pedestrians, and crouched beside her. "I need a date for a wedding. Want to come?" Ava blinked, certain she was hallucinating, but Daniel Whitmore wasn't joking. In that moment, two very different worlds collided, and the city would soon be buzzing about the woman who shocked everyone. Ava stared at him, eyes narrowing. Her first instinct was suspicion. Men didn't just walk up offering miracles, not in her world. Definitely not men in tailored suits and polished shoes worth more than everything she owned. But something about his voice was steady, calm, serious. He wasn't trying to laugh at her or take advantage. He just stood there, as if giving her a choice most people never had. "What's the catch?" she asked cautiously, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "No catch, I just need a +1 for a wedding. One night, good food, a nice dress. You'll be safe, I promise." His eyes held no arrogance, only a flicker of something unspoken. Bitterness, maybe even pain. Ava's stomach growled, her bones ached. A warm place, food and dignity, even for a day? It sounded like paradise. Still, she hesitated. She hadn't looked in a mirror in weeks. Her nails were chipped, her skin dry. What if it was a setup? But then again, what did she have to lose? "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go." A faint smile tugged at Daniel's lips. He helped her up with a firm hand, and for a moment, Ava forgot how cold the sidewalk had been. She limped slightly as they walked, and Daniel noticed, but didn't comment. Instead, he opened the back door of his car and nodded for her to enter. Ava slid into the warm leather seat, feeling the contrast between her world and his. It felt like a dream, one she feared might vanish at any moment. But Daniel had already pulled out his phone. "I'll have my assistant take you to a salon and boutique. You'll be transformed by tomorrow evening." As the car rolled through Manhattan, Ava realized she'd just accepted the most unexpected invitation of her life. The car stopped outside an upscale boutique that looked like it belonged in a fashion magazine. Ava hesitated as Daniel's driver opened her door. She stepped out cautiously, suddenly very aware of the dirt on her clothes and the lingering scent of street life that clung to her. Heads turned as she passed through the glass doors, eyes narrowing with judgment. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. A sharply dressed woman approached, clipboard in hand and a Bluetooth earpiece tucked neatly in her ear. "You must be Ava. Mr. Whitmore said to give you the full VIP experience," she said, scanning Ava quickly before her professional smile returned. "Right this way." Ava followed her through a maze of elegant rooms lined with silk, satin and sequins. Tailors and assistants buzzed around her like bees to honey. She was ushered into a private fitting room where racks of designer gowns awaited, each more breathtaking than the last. A team of stylists swarmed in, hair, makeup, nails. They didn't speak much at first, their eyes filled with curiosity and silent judgment. But as they worked, Ava's posture straightened. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Her matted hair was now a sleek, wavy bob, her skin smooth and glowing, her eyes lined with a smoky finish that made them pop. And the dress? It was a floor-length, deep emerald green gown that hugged her in all the right places. Elegant, bold, unforgettable. When the team finally stepped back, mouths slightly agape, Ava blinked at her reflection. For the first time in years, she saw herself. Not the version life had kicked around, but the woman she could be. Daniel walked in a moment later, his eyes sweeping over her silently. "Perfect," he said. And just like that, the homeless woman had vanished, replaced by a mystery no one at the wedding would see coming. The boutique had fallen quiet. Even the stylists, who moments earlier had been rushing between brushes and blow dryers, now stood back, staring at Ava like they couldn't believe their own creation. But it wasn't just the transformation that left them breathless. It was the way Ava stood, regal, still, like someone who had known pain but chose not to let it define her. Daniel stood beside the full-length mirror, watching her through the reflection. He saw the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders squared and her chin lifted. This wasn't about vanity. It was something deeper, something powerful. "How does it feel?" he asked, voice low. "Strange," Ava replied, her eyes locked on her reflection. "Like I'm wearing someone else's life." "You're not. You're just seeing the version of yourself the world tried to bury." A flicker of emotion crossed her face. Pain, gratitude, maybe even fear. Ava had once dreamed of nights like this, of glittering gowns and champagne toasts, but life had rewritten her story with chapters she never wanted to read. Yet here she was, turning a new page with a man she didn't understand and a plan that still made no sense. Daniel checked his watch. "You'll need to be ready by 6. I'll have a car pick you up from the hotel." "Hotel?" He nodded. "I booked you a suite at the Fairmont. You'll be safe there tonight." She couldn't hide her shock. A warm bed? A room with walls? She didn't even remember the last time she'd slept on a mattress. "Thank you," she said, voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked at her then, not as a project, not as a favor, but as a woman who might just change everything. And neither of them realized the real show hadn't even started yet. The Fairmont Hotel stood tall against the Manhattan skyline, its name glowing in gold letters like a promise. As the town car pulled up to the grand entrance, Ava sat silently in the back seat, hands clasped together, heart racing. She had never been inside a hotel before, let alone one that looked like a palace dipped in moonlight. The driver opened her door with a respectful nod, and she stepped out slowly, careful not to trip in her new heels. A doorman tipped his hat and greeted her like she belonged, and for the first time in years, she didn't flinch at someone looking her in the eyes. Inside, the hotel lobby was a marble dream. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and soft piano music drifted through the air. The receptionist welcomed her by name, barely hiding her curiosity as she handed Ava the keycard. "Penthouse suite." The words made Ava's throat tighten. The elevator ride was silent and surreal. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a hallway that smelled of orchids and clean linen. Her suite door unlocked with a soft click, and then she saw it. A king-size bed with snow-white sheets, a velvet chaise lounge, a full dining area, a view of the city that made her knees weak. She walked further in, finding chocolates on the table, a robe laid out, and a note in clean handwriting. "Rest well tonight. Tomorrow, you become unforgettable. Daniel." Ava sat on the edge of the bed, too stunned to move. For so long she had lived invisible. Now she was here, in a life she didn't understand. She pulled the covers over herself and stared at the ceiling. If this was a dream, she prayed it wouldn't end. But deep down, Ava knew the real storm was coming. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the penthouse suite like liquid gold. Ava stirred beneath the plush duvet, momentarily confused by the softness beneath her. No subway rats, no cardboard beds, no biting cold, just silence and warmth. For the first time in years, she had slept deeply, safely. She sat up, brushing a strand of hair from her face and letting the reality sink in. This wasn't a dream, it was real. The mirror across the room confirmed it. She still wore the emerald green silk robe that had been left for her the night before. Another gift from Daniel. A knock at the door startled her. "Room service, miss." She opened the door to a silver tray of breakfast. Scrambled eggs, smoked salmon, pastries, and a fresh pot of coffee. There was another note tucked between the plates. "Be ready by 5 p.m. I'll meet you in the lobby. And don't worry, I pulled some strings. You're officially on the guest list." "The W?" Ava blinked. Guest list? Wait, this wasn't just about walking through the doors with him. She was going to be seen, recognized. She wasn't going to blend into the background of the most lavish wedding of the year. She'd be seated among New York's elite, and her name would be on the record? Why? She whispered to herself. What game was Daniel really playing? Her mind spun as she ate breakfast, slowly adjusting to the weight of what lay ahead. She couldn't afford to look confused or weak, not tonight. By late afternoon, her stylist arrived again with the final gown, matching heels and diamond earrings that glittered like stars. As Ava stepped into the dress once more, she didn't feel like the girl from the streets anymore. She felt like a woman walking into war, with mystery, beauty, and Daniel Whitmore at her side. Daniel stood in the Fairmont lobby, adjusting the cuff of his designer tuxedo. Every detail of the evening had been planned, every movement calculated. But one thing he hadn't planned for was the pounding of his heart. He'd picked up countless women for business galas and society events, but tonight felt different. He wasn't bringing a model or a socialite. He was bringing a woman the world had forgotten, and she was about to steal every headline. The elevator chimed. Heads turned. And then she appeared. Ava stepped out, the emerald gown hugging her curves like it was made from moonlight. Her posture was effortless, her gaze steady. Her hair framed her face with soft, vintage waves, and the diamond earrings danced with every step she took. There was something haunting about her beauty, like pain and power had been woven into her skin. Daniel stared, momentarily stunned. He'd expected elegance, but this? She looked like the kind of woman who belonged. Every room. A woman who could silence an entire ballroom with one glance. "You look," he started, his voice trailing. "Unrecognizable?" she said, a small smirk on her lips. "No, unforgettable." He offered her his arm and she slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. The warmth of her touch surprised him. She didn't tremble or hesitate. She walked beside him like a woman who had conquered worse things than stares and whispers. As the car rolled toward the wedding venue, a grand cathedral draped in flowers and gossip, Daniel caught her looking out the window. "You still sure you want to go through with this?" She didn't look at him, just nodded once. "I've got nothing to lose." He smiled faintly. "You're wrong. After tonight, you might just have everything to gain." The cathedral glowed under the golden dusk light, its arched entrance adorned with cascading roses, crystal chandeliers and velvet ropes. Luxury cars lined the cobblestone driveway. Paparazzi hovered near the gates, their lenses twitching toward anything that glittered. And, when Daniel's car pulled in, they immediately sprang to attention. Daniel stepped out first, cool and composed, but it wasn't him that made the flashbulbs go wild. It was Ava. As she emerged from the car, cameras snapped like fireworks. She didn't flinch. Her head was held high, every step deliberate. She didn't try to smile. She didn't need to. She was mystery wrapped in elegance, and for a moment, the chaos paused. The whispers began instantly. Who is she? Is that his new fiancée? Where did he find her? Daniel leaned in close as they walked up the steps. Ignore them, they're just shot. That's the point, isn't it? She murmured. Inside, the cathedral was transformed into a fairy tale. Candlelight flickered off crystal centerpieces, and a string quartet played something soft and pretentious. Guests mingled in designer suits and gowns, sipping champagne and feeding each other stories. And then all heads turned. Madison Hayes, the bride, was descending the grand staircase with her groom to be on her arm, a tall, smug tech investor named Chase Reynolds. She wore a dress so white it nearly blinded, and her smile tightened the moment she saw Daniel. But it was Ava her eyes locked on. Madison's brows lifted ever so slightly. Confusion, then curiosity, then something bitter. Daniel guided Ava to their front row seats, directly across from the bride and groom. Madison leaned toward her fiancé and whispered something, but her eyes never left Ava. Whatever this night was meant to be, the game had officially begun. The ceremony hadn't even started, yet Ava could feel the tension wrapping itself around her like a corset. Whispers swirled through the pews like smoke. Stares bounced from face to face. She wasn't just another guest. She was the question no one could answer. Daniel leaned back in his seat, calm as ever, his hand resting on the edge of the pew behind her. He looked completely at ease, but Ava noticed the slight twitch in his jaw whenever Madison's laughter rang a little too loud. Across the aisle, Madison clutched her fiancé's arm just a little tighter, her smile as sharp as broken glass. Her groom, Chase, followed her gaze to Ava, then leaned in and whispered something that made Madison's nose flare. Ava's eyes met Madison's, and for a second, everything else faded. It was the kind of look that only two women could share, one rooted in unspoken war. No words, just a silent exchange of fire. Who is she? Ava could almost hear Madison thinking. Where did he find her? Ava tilted her head slightly, letting her lips curl into the faintest, calmest smile. It wasn't forced, it wasn't fake, it was fearless. Daniel noticed. "You're a natural at this," he whispered under his breath. "Is this what revenge feels like?" she asked softly, not looking at him. He hesitated. Maybe, or maybe it's just balance. The organ music began. The audience turned forward, but Ava could still feel Madison's eyes drilling into the side of her head like lasers. She was supposed to be a nobody, a background blur, but here she was, center stage, outshining the bride without even trying. And deep in her gut, Ava knew something. This wedding wasn't just going to change Daniel's story. It was about to rewrite hers. The hush in the cathedral was almost sacred. Rows of guests leaned forward in anticipation as the priest stepped up to the altar, clearing his throat. Chase and Madison stood hand in hand before him, framed by towering bouquets and gold-trimmed archways. To the crowd, they looked perfect, powerful, beautiful. But Ava saw something else. She saw Madison's knuckles whiten around her bouquet. She saw the way Chase kept glancing at Daniel, nervous, unsure. She saw a performance unraveling behind polished smiles. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The priest's voice faded into the background as Ava tuned into the subtle tension flowing like an undercurrent through the front row. Madison hadn't taken her eyes off Ava once since she walked in. It was subtle, barely noticeable to the rest of the room, but Ava could feel it, razor sharp and persistent. She whispered to Daniel, eyes still forward, "You think she's going to lose it?" "If she does, she'll wait until after the kiss. Madison doesn't ruin her own spotlight." But Ava wasn't so sure. Something in Madison's jaw said otherwise. She looked like a bride on the verge of an explosion. Chase began his vows, something about eternal love, partnership, tech dreams and sunsets. It was poetic, rehearsed. Ava could see Madison fighting to keep her fake smile wide. Then came Madison's turn. She took the mic, cleared her throat, and turned slightly, not just to face Chase, but just enough so that Ava could see her eyes directly. "To my first and only choice," she began, her voice soft but dripping with syrupy venom. "You are everything I've ever dreamed of. Unlike the past, you were never a mistake." A few guests chuckled. Daniel raised a brow but said nothing. The jab was clear. But Ava had survived far worse than pretty words laced with poison. And if Madison thought that was going to shake her, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The ceremony ended in a thunder of applause and carefully staged tears. Madison and Chase kissed under the arch, photographers snapped away, and the choir erupted into a joyful hymn. But for Ava, the real performance was just beginning. By the time they reached the reception hall, a massive ballroom dripping in candlelight and gold accents, the energy had shifted. Everyone was watching. Every movement Ava made, every word she spoke, every smile she gave Daniel, it was all being studied. And Madison? She was circling like a hawk in heels. Ava and Daniel were seated at a prime table near the front, across from the newlyweds. Plates of hors d'oeuvres were placed before them by white-gloved waiters, but Ava barely touched hers. The adrenaline humming beneath her skin left little room for appetite. "You sure you're okay?" Daniel asked, his voice low, his eyes searching her face. "I've slept under bridges, Daniel. I think I can handle a party," she said coolly, sipping her champagne. He smiled, not just out of amusement but with something close to admiration. The MC called for toasts. One by one, family members and friends stood, raising glasses, offering praises, some sincere, others exaggerated and dripping in polite falsehoods. The crowd clapped, laughed, nodded along. Then Daniel stood. A hush fell across the room like a dropped curtain. He didn't look at Madison, not once. He kept his eyes on Chase as he raised his glass. "To bold decisions, and even bolder regrets," Daniel said, his voice sharp and slow. "May the past teach us how to value what's real." Everyone froze. Madison's smile twitched. Ava didn't flinch. Instead, she gently tapped her glass to Daniel's and took a sip, calm, unfazed. And in that moment, with every eye on her, Ava realized something stunning. She was the real storm in the room, and it had only just started to thunder. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Daniel's toast had landed like a perfectly aimed dagger, clean, polite, and devastating. Guests laughed nervously, eyes bouncing between the tables of the newlyweds and the mysterious woman sitting beside Daniel Whitmore. Ava didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her stillness was louder than applause. Madison, however, was seething behind her flawless bridal mask. She leaned over to Chase and whispered something, lips tight, eyes cutting toward Ava like twin lasers. Then, with practiced grace, she stood and tapped her champagne glass gently with her fork. "May I say a few words?" she asked, smiling sweetly as the MC quickly nodded and stepped aside. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smirk twitching at his lips. Ava didn't move. She braced herself, knowing what was coming. This wasn't going to be a thank you speech. Madison took the mic and scanned the room, pausing just long enough to gather attention. "Tonight, I married the love of my life, not the man who tried to buy my loyalty," she said, her voice warm but laced with venom. "I chose love. Real love. Not wealth, not ego, not image." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel blinked, his jaw tightening slightly, but Ava noticed he didn't interrupt. He let her speak. Madison turned her gaze toward their table and smiled again, like a queen delivering her final blow. "And to those who thought they could upstage today with theatrics," she added, eyes locked on Ava, "just know this. A crown fits only one head at a time." A beat of silence. Ava raised her brow slightly and sipped her champagne without a word. Daniel clapped, slow, deliberate, unimpressed. "Beautiful speech, Madison," he said loudly, "almost as beautiful as your fear." Gasps again. The room erupted in whispers. Madison's eyes burned. And Ava? She simply turned to Daniel and whispered, with a coolness she didn't know she had. "Ready when you are, Kingmaker." And just like that, the bride's strike had missed its mark. The real queen wasn't wearing white tonight. The music shifted, soft jazz melting into a classic slow waltz as servers cleared the last of the plates. The MC announced the opening dance, inviting the bride and groom to take the floor. Madison clutched Chase's hand and moved toward the center, her gown sweeping behind her like a wave of ice. The crowd clapped politely, though the whispers never stopped. Phones were out, social media was already buzzing. Daniel leaned toward Ava, voice smooth and teasing. "How are you holding up, Cinderella?" Ava glanced at him, eyes calm. "I thought this was her fairy tale." "It is," Daniel said with a quiet smile. "We're just rewriting the ending." As Madison and Chase danced in choreographed elegance, Ava watched the bride's face. The smile Madison wore now wasn't for her husband. It was still aimed at her, still locked on the woman she couldn't outshine. Then, without warning, Daniel stood and held out his hand to Ava. "Your turn," he said softly. Ava froze for half a second. She wasn't a dancer, not in ballrooms, not under chandeliers, not in front of hundreds of wealthy strangers, but something inside her clicked. Why not? She thought. She had already shattered expectations, why stop now? She placed her hand in his. The crowd murmured as the two stepped onto the dance floor. All eyes turned. Even the band hesitated before shifting into a softer, slower rhythm. Daniel's hand settled on her waist. Her other hand slipped into his. He moved confidently, leading her into a graceful turn, and to her surprise, her body followed, fluid, effortless, like she belonged. The room grew quieter. Even Madison stopped mid-spin to watch. This time, Ava did smile. Because in that moment, she didn't feel homeless. She didn't feel like an outsider. She felt powerful. And as they danced beneath the chandeliers, the entire wedding watched in stunned silence, while the bride stood frozen on the sidelines. Ava hadn't come to fit in. She'd come to reign. As the final note of the waltz faded, applause erupted across the ballroom. But it wasn't for Madison and Chase. It was for Ava and Daniel. Some clapped with genuine awe, others with stunned curiosity. Madison, on the other hand, didn't clap at all. Her hand remained locked around her champagne glass. Her eyes narrowed like a cat cornered by a lion. Daniel led Ava back to their table, pulling her chair out like a true gentleman. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. Ava could feel the weight of his silence. He was thinking, calculating. She leaned closer. So what now? We've danced, we've toasted, we've stared down your ex-fiancée. What's the end game here? Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her. For a moment, his polished armor cracked. It's not just about revenge, Ava, he said quietly. It's about history. Ava blinked. What history? He hesitated. I didn't just lose Madison. I lost everything when she left. The business deal I was working on fell apart. Investors pulled out. My name was dragged through the tabloids, and she made sure of it. Ava's brows furrowed. She set you up. She humiliated me, strategically, publicly. After 3 years together, she walked away and leaked stories about me being emotionally unstable, manipulative, cold. She painted herself as the victim, but behind the scenes she was working with Chase to steal my biggest real estate contract. Ava sat back slowly, her mind piecing it all together. So this wedding isn't just a heartbreak, it was war. Daniel nodded, eyes dark. I didn't bring you here to impress anyone. I brought you here because she needed to see that I'm still standing. And not just standing, winning. Ava tilted her head. And you thought a homeless woman with nothing to lose was your best weapon? No, Daniel said, voice low. I thought a woman with fire in her eyes and nothing to prove was exactly what this night needed. Ava didn't smile this time, she just nodded. Because maybe, for the first time in her life, someone actually saw her. And not just who she had been, but who she was becoming. Dinner had ended, the cake had been cut, and most guests were tipsy enough to dance without shame, but the spotlight wasn't done with Ava. Not by a long shot. The MC returned to the stage, tapping the mic. Before we wrap up the evening with our final song, we'd like to invite anyone who'd like to offer a word or toast to the happy couple. Most people clapped lazily, uninterested. But then, the unexpected happened. A man from the crowd, someone from Daniel's former investment circle, stood and called out, "Actually, I'd love to hear a few words from the stunning woman seated next to Mr. Whitmore." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. All eyes turned to Ava. Daniel looked over at her, about to intervene, but Ava gently touched his wrist. No words, just a nod. She stood, slowly. The room fell completely still. The MC hesitated, then offered her the microphone. Ava stepped onto the same stage where Madison had delivered her sharp-edged toast earlier. Her emerald gown shimmered under the chandeliers. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. She scanned the crowd, not rushed, not flustered, measured. Calm. "Congratulations to Madison and Chase," she began, her voice steady and clear. "May your union be filled with truth, trust, and all the things money can't buy." Madison stiffened, her smile stretched thin. "I'm not part of this world," Ava continued. "I wasn't raised in it, I wasn't invited to it, but somehow I found myself in the middle of it tonight. And I've learned something. This world may be dressed in diamonds and silk, but it's not nearly as polished as it looks." The crowd shifted, unsure whether to laugh or hold their breath. She turned her gaze toward Madison. "Sometimes the most valuable people are the ones you step over because you assumed they had nothing to offer." Then she smiled. "But sometimes those same people show up wearing emerald." The crowd erupted, gasps, chuckles, murmurs. Ava handed the mic back and walked off the stage without another word. Daniel stood as she returned, offering his hand. And as they walked out of the ballroom together, heads turning, jaws dropping, one truth became clear. The homeless woman didn't just attend the wedding. The ballroom doors closed behind them with a soft thud, muffling the shocked murmurs and stunned silence they'd left in their wake. Outside, the city air was cooler now, calmer, like even New York had paused to process what had just happened. Daniel exhaled, glancing sideways at Ava. "You realize you just hijacked the wedding of the year?" She shrugged, a quiet smile playing on her lips. "They handed me the mic. I just told the truth." They reached the waiting car and the chauffeur opened the door, but Daniel didn't move just yet. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "You impressed me tonight." Ava raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't the plan?" "No, the plan was to shake her. humiliate her a little, let her see what she missed out on. But you didn't just play a part. You became something else in there. Bigger. She looked at him, something vulnerable flashing in her eyes. For most of my life, I've been invisible, Daniel, forgotten, the kind of person people pretend not to see. Tonight, people saw me. That was new. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he opened the car door for her and gently said, "Then let's make sure no one ever forgets you again." They rode in silence at first. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Ava stared out the window, the lights of the city blinking like stars beneath their feet. She could still feel the eyes on her, still hear the applause, still see Madison's stunned face. But more than anything, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Power. The kind that doesn't come from money or fame. The kind that comes from surviving and then shining. And in that backseat, Ava knew. Her story was no longer about where she'd come from. It was about where she was headed next. The car slid through Manhattan's glittering streets like a black shark through water, silent and sleek. Ava leaned back against the leather seat, still reeling from the weight of everything. The applause, the cameras, the whispers, all of it still pulsed in her ears. But underneath it all, there was a quiet voice inside her asking, "Now what?" Daniel broke the silence. "I've got an idea." She turned to him, curious. He studied her carefully, almost cautiously now, like he was weighing the impact of his next words. "I want to offer you something. A job." Ava blinked. "A job?" "Not charity," he added quickly. "I mean it. I need someone to handle community outreach for one of my upcoming projects. We're developing transitional housing in Brooklyn, real, sustainable programs for people coming off the streets. We need someone who understands that world, who's lived it." She stared at him, stunned. "You want me to go from sleeping under bridges to sitting in boardrooms? You've already walked into a ballroom and owned it." "Ava, boardrooms are quieter." She laughed, short and disbelieving. "Why me?" "Because tonight, you didn't just impress a room full of rich strangers. You commanded it. You spoke with truth and dignity. And because you've got something most people in my world lack, perspective." She looked down at her hands, her freshly manicured nails now trembling slightly. "You don't have to answer now," he added. "Sleep on it, I'll give you time." The car pulled up in front of the Fairmont again. The driver stepped out, ready to open her door. Ava hesitated. She looked at Daniel, this man who had changed everything in a single day, who'd pulled her from the shadows not to fix her, but to reveal her. Then she smiled faintly. "Well, think about it." And as she stepped out into the cool night, heels clicking on the pavement, she realized she'd been given something she hadn't dared to dream of in years. Opportunity. The following morning, Ava stood barefoot in the center of her suite, sunlight bathing the room in a soft golden hue. The emerald gown lay draped over a chair like a quiet reminder of the night before. Her heels sat near the balcony doors, their glossy shine out of place next to a scuffed old pair of boots she had left behind. A piece of the woman she used to be. She stared at both pairs. The old and the new, the past and the future. A knock at the door pulled her from the moment. It was the hotel concierge, carrying a sleek white envelope. "Hand delivered by Mr. Whitmore's office, ma'am." Ava took it and shut the door gently behind her. Inside the envelope was a formal offer letter on Daniel's company letterhead, a starting salary, a description of the outreach role, health benefits, housing stipend, a company car. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just real, it was generous, it was life-changing. But it scared her too. Because accepting meant she couldn't hide anymore. No more disappearing into city corners or fading behind pity. She'd have to show up, be seen, be accountable. Ava stepped out onto the balcony, letting the cold air kiss her skin. She looked down at the city, the same streets she once slept on, begged on, vanished into, and now they looked different. She pulled out her phone and stared at Daniel's number, her thumb hovering over the call button. Then she looked over at the boots by the door again. Old Ava would have walked away. But new Ava? She pressed call. Daniel answered on the second ring. "I'm in," she said, simply. There was a pause, then a smile in his voice. "Good, let's build something no one expects." And with that, Ava closed the door on her past and stepped fully into her future. Ava's phone buzzed non-stop for the next 2 days. Unknown numbers, Instagram notifications, emails she didn't even remember setting up. The photo had gone viral. The photo. The moment she and Daniel had danced, her emerald gown catching the chandelier light, his hand on her waist, her chin lifted like royalty. Social media had exploded with curiosity. Who is she? Where did she come from? Fashion blogs called her the mystery woman of the year. Gossip sites labeled her Daniel Whitmore's new flame. A few even speculated she was a supermodel in disguise. But others dug deeper. A blurry photo surfaced online, an older one. It showed Ava, homeless, sitting near the subway station just weeks ago. The contrast between the two images was shocking, and the internet did what it always does. It split. Some called her an inspiration, others called her a fraud. By the time Ava arrived at Daniel's downtown office on Monday morning, the lobby security recognized her immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Monroe. Mr. Whitmore's expecting you." Ms. Monroe. She still wasn't used to that. Upstairs, Daniel was already in a meeting, pacing in front of a massive window with views of the skyline. When he saw her, he excused himself and walked over. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I'm being picked apart online like a science project." "Welcome to being interesting," he replied. "We can control the narrative, Ava. You just need to decide what you want it to be." Ava thought for a moment. "I don't want pity. I don't want to be a headline or someone's charity mascot." "Then what do you want?" She looked him in the eyes, her voice steady. "I want to be respected for what I've lived through, for who I'm becoming." Daniel smiled. "Then let's give them something worth talking about." And just like that, the media storm became her wind. She was ready to rise with it. A week later, Ava sat in the makeup chair of a major TV studio, nerves bubbling beneath her skin like shaken soda. The interview had been Daniel's idea, a carefully chosen opportunity to reclaim her story from the media frenzy. She wasn't going to be the mysterious woman in the emerald dress anymore. She was going to tell the truth. No edit, no spin. The producer, a chipper woman with a headset and clipboard, gave her a thumbs up. 2 minutes. "You're doing great, sweetheart. Just speak from the heart." Ava nodded, her palms slightly damp. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress. Her hair was pulled into a soft bun, makeup subtle, natural. She looked like a woman who belonged in the room. Across the studio, the host, a polished woman named Valeria Stone, smiled warmly from behind her desk. "And we're back in 5, 4, 3... The cameras rolled, the lights flared. Valeria turned to face Ava. "Tonight, we have with us Ava Monroe, the woman the world can't stop talking about. From the streets of New York to the spotlight of one of the city's biggest society weddings, her story has captured the nation's attention. But who is she, really?" Ava smiled gently. "I'm someone who was overlooked for a very long time, not because I didn't matter, but because people assumed I didn't." "And how did you end up at Daniel Whitmore's side that night?" He asked me a question that no one else had in years. He asked if I wanted to be seen. The room went quiet. "And you said yes?" "I didn't just say yes," Ava replied. "I showed up. For the first time in a long time, I chose myself." The interview lasted 12 minutes. It was honest, raw, and powerful. When it ended, Ava stepped out of the studio to find her phone blowing up again. But this time, the messages were different. Daniel called later that night. "You broke the internet," he teased. "No," Ava said, smiling to herself. "I found my voice." And for the first time, she wasn't running from her past. She was owning her whole story on her terms. He said. Next, ChatGPT said. Across town, inside a penthouse filled with florals that had already begun to wilt, Madison Hayes stared at the television screen in disbelief. Her freshly manicured fingers clenched around a wine glass as she watched Ava's interview play out again. This time, on a major news outlet's replay segment. "She's not even that well-spoken," she muttered bitterly, slamming the remote onto the couch. Her new husband, Chase, didn't respond. He sat quietly on the opposite end of the room, pretending to scroll through emails, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Madison turned on him. "Are you just going to sit there while she makes me look like the villain?" Chase raised an eyebrow. "You did throw a jab at her during the wedding. Multiple, actually." "Oh, please. Don't act like you didn't enjoy it when I did." Now everyone's treating her like some kind of phoenix rising from the ashes, the world's favorite underdog. He sighed, standing up. Maybe because she is. People love a redemption story, Madison, and right now, she's telling hers a whole lot better than you're telling yours. Madison's eyes narrowed. So what? You're on her side now? I'm on the side that's not self-destructing on national television. She scoffed, storming toward the massive glass windows. From this height the city looked small, and yet, somehow, that woman, Ava Monroe, had managed to make her, Madison Hayes, feel even smaller. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her notifications. Her name was being mentioned, but always in Ava's shadow. Madison Hayes, Daniel Whitmore's ex-fiancée. Madison Hayes throws shade at Ava Monroe, the icy bride who couldn't outshine the emerald guest. Her lip quivered, rage simmering just beneath the surface. I gave this city glamour, class, prestige. And now it worships a woman who used to beg for food? Chase didn't reply. He'd already left the room. But Madison wasn't done. If Ava Monroe wanted a spotlight, she was about to get one. Because Madison had just decided she was going to ruin her. 2 days later, Ava arrived at her new office on the top floor of Whitmore Developments, wearing a crisp cream blouse and tailored black trousers. She was getting used to the looks, the curious stares from employees, the double takes in the elevator. Some were supportive, some envious, others skeptical. But none of them mattered. She was here now, and she was working. Daniel had given her a team, a budget, and full authority to shape a pilot outreach program for homeless rehabilitation. She threw herself into it, interviewing shelter directors, listening to caseworkers, walking through old neighborhoods with people who used to sleep on the same streets she did. For the first time in years, she felt a purpose blooming in her chest. But outside those walls, something darker was spreading. It started with a headline. Who really is Ava Monroe? The truth behind the Emerald Guest. Then came the articles. Anonymous sources claimed she had been arrested multiple times, that she'd lied about her homelessness for clout, that Daniel was only using her for attention. One blogger posted an unflattering photo of Ava from years ago, complete with cruel commentary. From panhandler to princess, but for how long? Ava saw it while sipping coffee at her desk. Her fingers went cold around the cup. Daniel walked in moments later, already holding a printout of the same article. She's striking back, he said plainly. Madison, this is her style. Quiet sabotage. She'll use media, gossip, fake sources. She doesn't care how low she has to go. Ava set the coffee down, steadying her breath. Better. Daniel blinked. You're not worried? Ava leaned back in her chair, eyes fierce now. She can whisper all she wants. I'm not the same woman I was under that bridge. And if she wants war, then she's going to find out. I know how to survive in the dark. And I've already learned how to shine in the light. Madison wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. Her manicured hands flew over her laptop keyboard late into the night, digging through old court records, shelter logs, anything that could smear Ava Monroe's name. She hired a shady PR consultant who specialized in reputation correction, which really meant launching subtle character assassinations disguised as concerned journalism. Find something, anything, she hissed. I don't care if she stole a sandwich in 2017. Make it sound like grand theft. The consultant gave a half nod, barely blinking. Yes, ma'am. By the time I'm done, no one will remember the dress. They'll only remember the dirt. Meanwhile, Ava kept showing up. Day after day. Focused, grounded, real. She didn't respond to the slander. She didn't go live on Instagram. She didn't cry on a talk show couch. Instead, she let her work speak. The outreach program gained traction. Her interviews gained credibility. Formerly homeless people began to post about her online. People who had actually known her from the streets. She shared her food with me when we had nothing. She gave me her blanket in the dead of winter. She's not faking a damn thing. One post from a shelter nurse even went viral. Ava Monroe was forgotten by this city, and now she's feeding it back with both hands. Anyone trying to tear her down should ask themselves why they're so threatened by her rise. Daniel watched it all unfold in silence. He didn't interfere. You're handling this better than I would, he admitted during one of their late-night strategy meetings. Ava didn't look up from the documents in front of her. That's because I've already lived through worse. Letting someone like Madison drag me back into the mud, that's giving her power she doesn't deserve. But behind her calm eyes, she knew the game was shifting. Madison wasn't just throwing stones. She was digging graves. And Ava was determined not to fall into one of them. She'd climbed out of too many already. A week later, Madison sent out invitations. Elegant, handwritten, sealed with gold wax. It was billed as a private charity gala in support of women's wellness and empowerment, hosted at her penthouse, exclusive guest list, strictly invite only. Of course, Ava Monroe received one. Daniel found the envelope on her desk. "You're not actually going, are you?" Ava studied the invitation, her expression unreadable. "It's a setup," he continued. "She's planning something. This has Madison's fingerprints all over it. Graceful on the outside, venom underneath." "I know," Ava replied. "That's why I'm going." Daniel's brow creased. "Ava, you've already won. You don't need to prove." "I'm not going to prove anything," she interrupted calmly. "I'm going to end this." Daniel stared at her. She was so composed, so clear-eyed. She didn't look nervous, she looked ready. The night of the gala, Ava arrived in a silver floor-length dress that shimmered with every step. No cameras, no paparazzi, just hushed murmurs as she entered Madison's glass-walled penthouse, filled with socialites, influencers, and powerful women sipping expensive cocktails. Madison spotted her immediately. "Ava!" she cooed, floating over in a glittering champagne gown. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure you'd show after all the noise." Ava smiled politely. "Oh, you mean the rumors you helped plant?" Madison's smile tightened. "So brave of you to walk into a room where no one knows what's really true about you." "Actually," Ava said, glancing around, "I think they know more than you think." Just then, a tall woman stepped forward. Camille Rhodes, the editor-in-chief of a prominent lifestyle magazine. "Ava, I loved your interview. We'd be honored to feature you in next month's issue. Cover story." Madison blinked, stunned. Ava turned to her smoothly. "Funny thing about the truth, Madison, you can't kill it in silk and candles." She took her champagne, raised her glass slightly, and added, "But you, keep trying." Then she walked away, leaving Madison frozen in a room she no longer controlled. The trap had been set, but the only person caught in it was the one who dug it. Madison slammed her bedroom door shut behind her, the sounds of clinking glasses and polite chatter muffled by the thick walls. She paced barefoot on the marble floor, fury pouring out in uneven breaths. Cover story? Ava Monroe was about to be on the cover of Her Story magazine. The same one that had once labeled Madison the Queen of Uptown, the same one that had begged for exclusives from her wedding. Now they were fawning over her replacement. She yanked open a drawer and pulled out her tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen as she called her PR consultant again. "We're going nuclear." On the other side of the line, a sleepy voice mumbled, "Madison, maybe it's time to..." I said, "Nuclear." The next morning, an anonymous email was blasted to nearly every major media outlet in the city. It contained heavily edited footage, out-of-context shelter records, and a manipulated audio clip that made it sound like Ava had once faked a pregnancy to get into a woman's shelter. The goal was simple: destroy Ava's credibility before the magazine cover hit newsstands. But Ava, already warned by a trusted former shelter worker that something was coming, had prepared. She and Daniel released a short documentary-style video, interviews from shelter staff, police officers, former homeless peers, and even city officials. It told the unfiltered story of Ava Monroe, her fall, her survival, her climb. It dropped just hours before Madison's smear campaign hit. The public didn't just believe Ava. They defended her. Comments poured in. "We've seen enough takedowns. Let this woman rise." Madison Hayes is giving desperate ex energy. They tried to bury her, but forgot she's a seed. Madison watched her narrative unravel in real time. And for the first time, she understood. Ava wasn't playing her game anymore. She had rewritten the rules. And Madison? She was finally running out of moves. Madison Hayes had always believed in her own invincibility. Money, beauty, social clout, those were her weapons. But now, for the first time in her carefully curated life, she was losing. Not quietly, not gracefully, and not to another socialite or heiress. She was losing to Ava Monroe. Her lawyer had just called, defamation charges were being drafted, the magazine had issued a statement backing Ava, the publisher had confirmed the Her Story cover already printed, already en route to stands across the country. Worse, Ava's video had already amassed over 6 million views in 24 hours. Madison's name was trending, but not in the way she wanted. Hashtags like Madison Exposed and Support Ava Monroe littered every platform. People were mocking her, turning her once iconic wedding into memes, calling her the petty bride who tried to cancel a survivor. Inside her penthouse, Madison's world was crumbling. Meanwhile, at Whitmore Developments, Ava stood at the head of a sleek boardroom, presenting her vision for a chain of transitional housing units with integrated job training centers. Daniel watched from the back of the room, pride clear in his eyes. When she finished, the applause from the board echoed through the glass walls. Later that evening, as the two of them sat in Daniel's private lounge sipping wine, his phone buzzed. "It's Hurt," he said, glancing at the screen. "Madison. Again." Ava didn't even look up, let her spiral. Daniel smirked and set the phone down. "She's calling everyone, lawyers, journalists, PR firms. She's trying to salvage what's left of her image." "Let her," Ava repeated calmly. "You can't salvage a foundation built on lies." He looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had once slept beneath neon lights and newspaper blankets was now sitting in front of him, composed, brilliant, and unstoppable. "You've changed," he said. "No," Ava replied. "I just finally stopped hiding." And somewhere across the city, Madison Hayes stared at a cracked mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't untouchable anymore. She was defeated. And Ava, she hadn't even raised her voice. She had risen instead. The next morning, Manhattan awoke to the image of Ava Monroe staring back from newsstands, coffee shop counters, and glowing billboards. Her face, soft yet fierce, framed by natural curls and the hint of a knowing smile, sat under bold, confident lettering. Ava Monroe from shadows to spotlight. Her Story magazine, cover issue. In the article, Ava spoke of homelessness not as a tragedy but as a truth, a shared reality for thousands. She talked about survival without shame, about human dignity, and about what it meant to rise without forgetting the street beneath your feet. Her quote at the end sealed the cover's legacy. "You don't need a miracle to rise, you just need someone to look at you and say, 'I see you, I believe in you.' And when no one does, say it to yourself." People wept, people reposted, people rallied. She became a symbol not just of reinvention, but of resilience. Across the city, Madison saw the issue stacked on shelves and refused to look. Every headline that once would have belonged to her now belonged to the woman she tried to erase. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone buzzed with new opportunities. Donations to the Ava-led outreach initiative flooded in. Celebrities offered public support. Other survivors came forward to share their stories because she had made it okay to speak. At a private rooftop gathering, Daniel handed Ava a copy of the magazine, signed by the editorial team, with a note that read, "Thank you for letting us tell your truth." She held the magazine quietly, her fingers running over the glossy paper. Daniel watched her. "You do realize you've become one of the most talked about women in the country, right?" Ava smiled. "Then let's use it for something bigger than me." Because while the world was still catching its breath from her story, Ava was already planning what came next. 2 weeks later, Ava stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University, delivering the keynote speech for the city's first ever Voices of the Forgotten Summit. Politicians, business leaders, shelter directors, and survivors filled the seats. Her image graced the banners. Her name drew a standing ovation before she even spoke. She wore a tailored white suit, simple and commanding, and stood alone behind the podium, with no script in hand. "When I slept on the streets, I used to imagine being invisible was a superpower," she began. "But the truth is, I wasn't invisible. I was just ignored." Her voice was strong, her presence magnetic. She spoke of second chances, not as gifts from the powerful, but as bridges we build for one another. She urged those in the room to reimagine how they approached homelessness, not as a problem to solve, but as people to empower. and somewhere in the back of the auditorium, Madison sat, quietly, behind dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, almost hoping no one would recognize her. She'd come alone, her name no longer listed among the elite. She hadn't been invited, she had just shown up. Ava saw her, but she didn't flinch. She didn't call her out. She simply turned to the crowd and said, "The people who tried to bury you often forget. You were a seed, not a corpse." The auditorium exploded in applause. After the speech, Ava was swarmed by press, supporters, and city officials. A state senator asked for a private meeting. A billionaire offered to fund 5 new centers under her leadership. And still, Ava found time to pull a young woman aside, someone who looked like she hadn't eaten in days, and pressed a card into her hand. "Come see me, we'll talk about your story next." Later, Daniel met her outside, where the sun dipped low and golden. "You're no longer just a survivor," he said, eyes warm. Ava smiled. "I never was just anything." And the woman who had once been forgotten now wrote every ending on her own terms. It was a grey morning, the kind New Yorkers called moody, where the clouds hung low and the streets glistened with last night's rain. Ava stood outside the old subway station where Daniel had first found her, 49th Street, her former shelter in plain sight. She wore sneakers, jeans, and a soft wool coat. No glam, no cameras, just her. He wasn't there for nostalgia. She was there to give back. Beside her, a van idled, filled with supplies, blankets, food kits, fresh socks, and handwritten cards from school children. She had brought a team of volunteers, not for a photo op, not for credit, but because this was where the work had started. One man shuffled up to her, hesitating. He was gaunt with hollow eyes and a timid posture. "Are you Ava Monroe?" She smiled and nodded. "That's me." He looked like he might cry. "You used to sleep near the West Wall. I remember. People didn't talk to you much, but you gave me your last apple once, years ago." Ava blinked. "I remember you. You were always humming, even in the winter." They stood there in silence, the city buzzing around them like it always did. Then she said softly, "You ready to change your life?" He looked up, eyes filled with something fragile, hope. "You think someone like me can?" She smiled wider. "I know you can, 'cause I already did." Across the street, Daniel watched from the car, arms crossed, a look of quiet pride on his face. He didn't interfere. This moment belonged to her. Later that night, Ava returned to her apartment, modest but beautiful, warm, hers. She hung a photo on her wall, her standing at the subway entrance, handing a care kit to the man from earlier. No filters, no flashes. Just truth. The woman who once had nothing now had everything that mattered. And still she gave it away freely, because that's what real power does. It lifts others too. 6 months later, the Ava Monroe Foundation had expanded across 3 boroughs. Transitional housing units were opening, community centers were thriving, and employment programs she'd helped design were placing people into real jobs with livable wages. Her story wasn't just a headline anymore, it was a movement. She walked into her office one morning to find stacks of letters waiting, handwritten notes from strangers, survivors, teens, grandmothers, runaways, CEOs. "You gave me permission to dream again. I stopped hiding because of you. You reminded me I still matter." She read every single one. Meanwhile, Madison Hayes had quietly left the city. A soft press release cited privacy and personal healing. The empire she once ruled had moved on without her. The society pages barely noticed her absence. And Ava? She stood on stages, she walked through shelters, she sat beside mothers who wept into their palms, and she listened. Not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as someone who had been there. One day, Daniel found her in the conference room, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. "What's next?" he asked. Ava looked out at the city skyline, glowing gold under a morning sun. "We keep building, not for applause, not for headlines, just because we can." He smiled. "You still amaze me." She turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't save me, Daniel. You just reminded me I was worth being seen." He nodded. "And you turned being seen into being unforgettable." As the sun rose higher, Ava stood tall in the light of everything she'd built. She was no longer the homeless woman in the corner, no longer the mysterious guest in the gown, no longer the target of gossip. She was Ava Monroe, the woman they tried to bury, the woman they couldn't break, and the woman the world would never forget. The end.